we move forward now still trying to talk about human sexuality from a biological perspective. But again, in almost every topic that comes up on this video, there's going to be some influence of culture, society. This quote at the very top, life is sexually transmitted. I took that from a different psychology textbook by David Myers, and I think that's just a really true summary of our interactions with the world. In a sense, it's a very Sigmund Freud perspective that we are animals. And just like other animals, we are here because of reproduction. That life is all about sex, at least from some level of analysis. Of course, in our day-to-day interaction, I hope it's not always about sex because, on different levels of analysis, there's so much more to life. But it depends, what type of perspective you take. So we're trying to strictly stay biological, but as we're going to see, almost impossible. So here we go. Hormones. Hormones are a regulatory substance in the body that travels through the bloodstream. And in terms of sex hormones, there are the androgens, also known as the male sex hormones, and the estrogens, also known as the female sex hormones. Androgens, one of the more famous ones is testosterone. Women have testosterone. It's just that males have at higher levels of testosterone, and thus androgens are called male sex hormones because there's more of them in males. Females have estradiol and other estrogens at higher levels than men do. And so the estrogens are considered the female sex hormones. What role do hormones play in human sexuality? Well, they do play a role. And so let's consider the idea that research has looked at sexual behavior in both males and females. When it comes to females, researchers have shown that sexual intercourse is more likely to occur during the ovulation period of a woman's menstrual cycle. So when a woman is actually in the process of ovulating, the chances of reproduction are way higher, obviously, compared to when she's not ovulating. Because when you're not releasing an egg, the likelihood of getting pregnant is way lower. So from an evolutionary standpoint, it makes sense that sex drive might be higher, or at least sexual behavior might be more frequent during ovulation because the chances of conception are higher. It doesn't exactly work like that for males. For males, one analogy I've heard is that testosterone is like gas in your tank. You have to have gas for your car to run, but more gas doesn't make your car run faster. So it is an important process, but it's not like the same in women in terms of the waxing and waning over a 28 to 30 day menstrual cycle. All right, some other quick notes. So we know that, let's see, just looking at my notes. Yes, so here's a very bizarre finding from research. One study found that erotic dancers or strippers tended to get more tips when they were ovulating. Now, how do we explain that? It's very difficult because we can't necessarily prove that, there's some like pheromones or something that are being transmitted from the erotic dancer to the patrons. Because what could also be happening is maybe during a woman's menstrual cycle, when she's ovulating, she might behave more in a more erotic manner. And that might be appreciated more by the patrons of the strip club. Very bizarre research. I have no idea how somebody gets funding for that type of research, by the way. Anyway, what else? Let's talk about one more, maybe two more quick examples. So one quick one is castration. And you can't really castrate humans in terms of ethics, but in dogs, what we see is that if you castrate or remove the testicles of male dogs, you often see a change in certain behaviors. They tend to get less dominant. They tend to show less marking territory behavior. So hormones, testosterone, for example, is produced by the testes. That obviously tells us that hormones play a role in regulating the human sexuality in terms of thoughts and behaviors. But one final idea, and this is the idea that females who live together often get in sync with their menstrual cycles. So this has been tested in humans and non-human animals. And let's talk about rats, for example. Imagine taking a group of female rats and putting them in a cage together. Over time, their menstrual cycles become in sync. And so how do we explain that? Well, evolutionary psychologists argue that this allows a competitive advantage to the most dominant female. In other words, let's say that there's only one male and there's a bunch of females. If they're all ovulating at the same time, that means that they're all capable of reproducing at the same time. And therefore, they're all going to compete for the attention of this one male. And who's going to win? Well, whoever's the most dominant female. And so this would be nature's way, perhaps, of ensuring that the best genes get passed forward. All right, very interesting stuff. But the research goes on. But the idea is that hormones do have some influence on our sexuality, just like all the other animals. I mean, we are biological creatures. So speaking of which, the physiological cycle that we go through when we have sex or engage in sexuality is known as the sexual response cycle. 4 stages involved. And just like all the other animals, it's a biological process. So let's talk about that first before we kind of expand on that idea. Step 1 is excitement. This means an increase in blood pressure, the heartbeat starts to pound a little faster, the genitals become engorged with blood. So that's step 1, excitement. Step 2 is known as plateau. Plateau is where you have an even higher increase in heart rate, increase in blood pressure, and orgasm feels imminent. And that's step 3, the orgasm, which is essentially pleasure and muscle contractions. The muscle contractions facilitate ejaculation for men, and it actually can change the position of the uterus in women, which actually some researchers suggest that although an orgasm for women is not necessary to reproduce, it might actually bring the sperm inward further to increase the likelihood of reproducing. Okay, step 4 is resolution. And what that means is returning to a baseline level, a calm physiological level. So the 4 steps: excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution. So first and foremost, biologically speaking, let's think about the orgasm. The orgasm, from an operant conditioning perspective, is nature's way of reinforcing sexual behavior. Recall from the learning chapter, operant conditioning suggests that if I do a behavior that results in a reward, that's going to increase the likelihood of me repeating that behavior. So the orgasm is, not just for pleasure. The orgasm is evolution's way of ensuring that we actually have sex to pass our genes forward. We tend to repeat behaviors that feel good. No surprise there. Now, again, it's a biological process here, the sexual response cycle. But unlike all the other animals, it can be regulated by psychological and socio-cultural influences. So for example, the year 2017, we have never seen so much pornography in our society. On the internet, it's all over the place. Think about, the internet and engaging in sexuality like masturbation. The idea is that that's not really all that biological in terms of like the way nature intended, computers, but it doesn't matter for humans, because for humans, the sexual response cycle is influenced by biological, psychological, and cultural factors. So, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with masturbation. What I'm saying is that the other animals masturbate too. Some of them do anyway. But the idea is that there's this cultural artifact. Internet pornography is such a human idea. Other animals, I don't think, can wrap their heads around pornography, or at least internet pornography anyway. I guess I'm not an expert on pornography in non-human animals. If you have any research on that, please send it my way. I think it might actually be really interesting. Anyway, but what about kinks and fetishes? Sometimes people get excited, or they initiate the sexual response cycle by random objects. So, for example, I don't know, glasses. Maybe you are turned on by glasses. I don't know, but the idea is that we learn associations through our culture that are far beyond just biological influence. Okay, you can't talk about human sexuality without discussing sexual orientation, which refers to the emotional and, of course, the erotic attraction we have towards other people. I have to start off by saying that the research in psychology on sexual orientation is pretty limited. Even in the year 2017, it's an understudied topic. One of the bigger issues is that if people are not open about their sexuality, it makes studying sexuality really difficult. So keep that in mind. But here's basically what we do know about sexual orientation so far. And I should mention there's a really decent discussion in the textbook about this as well. The first is when it comes to self-report, in other words, people who openly admit their sexual orientation, the research suggests that somewhere between 3% and maybe upwards of up to 10% in certain cultures self-report as homosexual. We have to consider that as self-report data. And when people are in let's say, a really conservative culture where maybe homosexuality is not accepted, you might not be comfortable expressing your true sexual identity. But nevertheless, in every culture, sexual orientation, in every culture that's been studied, homosexuality has been documented. So it's not just in certain cultures. It's a worldwide, it's everywhere. But I think an important consideration is that most of the research on sexual orientation looks at this as binary, as gay or straight. And today what we're seeing is that type of perception might be really limited. And one of the researchers who's trying to sort of break that apart is a man named Kinsey, who developed the Kinsey scale of sexual responses. And basically what Kinsey argued is that we should talk about and study and research sexual orientation as a spectrum, from entirely gay to entirely straight, with everything in between. Because basically what he's getting at is that sexual orientation is so much more than just sexual intercourse, for instance. It goes way beyond that. And so the argument is basically we're doing our society a disservice by just acting as though there's gay or straight with nothing else. That adds another element of complexity to researching this topic. But one of the important questions you have to consider is what actually influences sexual orientation? Why do some people become gay and become straight? Again, using those binary this or that terms. Is it nature or is it nurture? So, in sum, the research suggests that sexual orientation is something that we are born with, that is not easily changed. It probably cannot be changed at all. It's extremely inflexible, according to research. And so, here's what we have to consider. First and foremost, homosexuality has been documented in many, many other animals. Over 1,500 other animals that have been studied, homosexuality has been documented. So that tells us that maybe, because we are biological creatures as well, maybe it is natural, maybe it's biologically influenced. Again, the majority of humans identify as heterosexual, and the majority of other animals also engage in heterosexual behavior. But what we have to consider is that homosexuality is not it's not a dysfunction. It's part of the biology of us as animals in terms of there's going to be a percentage who are attracted to the same sex individual. All right. In addition, twin studies have shown that there's a genetic influence. About 50% of the variance within a population in terms of sexual orientation is attributed to genes. So basically what that means is that if you have identical twins, they share 100% of their DNA. If one twin identifies as homosexual, the chances that the other will also is significantly higher compared to non-identical twins or strangers. So we know that genes play a role. The research has also shown that there are some brain structural differences between heterosexuals and homosexuals, again, telling us that biology is playing a role. All right, so we could talk more about this, but definitely refer to the textbook for some more detail. But I just want to summarize the idea is that essentially there's no environmental influences that have been implicated in terms of sexual orientation. There's been no strong findings to suggest that people who identify as gay have experienced any significant environmental differences compared to people who identify as straight. The research suggests it is all biologically influenced, or at least overwhelmingly biologically influenced. Again, there's still, I think, more research that needs to be conducted in this area. But if that is the case, it tells us that sexual orientation is not a choice. And again, to have a quick side note, in terms of the implications in our society, to discriminate against somebody for their sexual orientation, that would suggest that it's similar to discriminating against somebody for having diabetes. These are biologically influenced ideas, at least generally speaking. All right, moving forward. Dysfunction. Not much to consider here, just some ideas again, that it's biological and environmental. The most common sexual dysfunctions for men are erectile dysfunction and premature ejaculation. And the most common sexual dysfunctions that are reported for women are pain during intercourse or orgasmic dysfunction, specifically the inability to achieve an orgasm. Now, all of these kind of share something in common, which is that biology does play a role. Like, let's just talk about erectile dysfunction, for example. There could be blood pressure issues that affect a man's ability to achieve an erection. But what research suggests is that men who have erectile dysfunction, they still tend to get an erection during their sleep. When they're in REM sleep, we get genital arousal, both men and women. And so if a man with erectile dysfunction is still getting an erection at night during their sleep, it tells us that it's not just biological factors that are influencing sexual dysfunction. It's things like cultural and social factors. For example, anxiety and stress. Earlier we talked about pornography. What if you're watching a lot of pornography and you get these perceptions of that's how you're supposed to be in bed, and so therefore if you think like, my partner won't be happy if I can't live up to these expectations, that could affect one's ability to quote unquote perform. The same thing tends to go for women. Let's say pain during intercourse. There could be serious biological issues, that a doctor should evaluate. But researchers have also shown that psychological factors play a role here as well. Things like stress. If you're not comfortable during sex because of anxiety or pressure, that can also bring about dysfunction or pain. So again, even when it comes to dysfunction, biopsychosocial influences. That's where we're going to end here. So motivation. Why do we have sex? Yes, we are animals. So biologically speaking, we have sex for reproduction, to pass our genes forward. Life is sexually transmitted. Maybe that's the ultimate goal, but it's not for everybody. So it goes beyond biological to psychological and social. Psychologically speaking, you can, maybe connect with somebody. You can get closer to somebody. Culturally speaking, think about like the influence of religion. Many people abstain from sex before marriage, and that tells us that there's a very strong cultural influence on their sexuality. So the motivation to have sex, I think, summarizes this entire slide. We are biopsychosocial creatures. We are less bound by instinct compared to any other animal in so many different areas, including human sexuality.